All right, well, we just finished chapter 22, and we're going to again jump forward now from Isaac, and we're going to look at Isaac's children, who are going to be Esau and Jacob. And there's so many lessons in these chapters, but I'm more trying to give you the broader picture and what happens with Esau and Jacob. We often refer to them actually as Jacob and Esau, but Esau's the older and Jacob's the younger. So again, I'm going to share my screen, and we're seeing the pivotal role that uh, these two individuals play really in understanding the nature of God and understanding the plan of God. And this really plays itself out in the New Testament, and specifically in the book of Romans, where the nation of Israel is like, oh yeah, we're your people, and so regardless of how we live, we know we're going to be with you in heaven, that we're going to be saved. And God says, no. And he then says, you know what? The example that I'm going to use for you should understand this is it's my sovereign choice. And if you're not going to live by faith, then there's no way that you're going to have a relationship with me. And so it is my sovereign choice, just like I chose Jacob over Esau. You should have understood that. If you don't live by faith, you will not be my people, because my people will live by faith. All right, so we're going to look at Genesis 25 through 36. So this is a big section. And it's more just trying to understand Jacob and Esau and the sovereign hand of God dealing with parents who are divided and brothers who can't get along. And it's a tragic, it's really, it's very interesting when you look at the Bible and you look at these families, and God doesn't try to sugarcoat it. He doesn't try to paint this picture of these people as something that they're not, but he just shows them for who they are. And this, if you haven't read the story, if you're not familiar with the story, it's just a really crazy situation. So I'm just going to give you some of the highlights. I'm not going to go deeply into it, but realize that Paul does use this in Genesis chapter 9 to help them, the nation, understand why God had not selected them to be his people because of their lack of faith, and that it was God's sovereign choice that he can choose whom he will choose to use and whom he will not. So, but into Genesis 25 through 36, we see this first. We have God's sovereign rule that's demonstrated in his choice of Jacob the younger over Esau the older. Culturally, the older would get the blessing, and that he would be the one who in the sense is favored, and that things are going to pass through him. And God is going to flip this because it's his sovereign choice. But what happens when you get to chapter 27 is that we're going to see just a really ugly side of the relationship that the parents between Isaac and Rebekah had with each other and with their children. And it's very instructive to us. I'm not sure that this is really the point of it in the narrative, but it is instructive to us, is that, look, if you are divided as parents, then you are going to have problems with your children. And they very clearly are divided as parents, but within respect of the narrative, what that means is that God is trying to take this and create a nation. And this nation, we said, is to represent God and his interests in the world. Well, they're not about that at all, because, you've got Isaac, who's of Esau, and you've got Rebekah, who's of Jacob, and they're really pitting the two kids against each other. And they are completely forgetting that they are supposed to be a team who is building a nation so that the entire world can be saved through this nation to undo the fall, for the rescue and the restoration to take place. And they completely miss it. They completely miss why they're there. And so they get bogged down in the crazy details of their own interests and their own lives. And God will, in his sovereign rule, use their craziness to still accomplish his purposes. And so what happens is that Isaac is hungry, and so he tells his son Esau to go out and to get food, because Esau's of the land and he's a hunter and a man's man. Okay, and so he's going to go out and get the food. Well, eavesdropping was his wife Rebekah, and she goes and tells Jacob, "Hey, you need to prepare. I'll prepare this lamb. You're going to give it to your father. You pretend that you're Esau, and you get the blessing, Esau's blessing." Okay. And so, how underhanded is that, to go against your husband, to undermine his authority, to go against his wishes, okay, and to undermine the very plan of God. But again, this goes right back to Genesis 3, that her desire is going to be to rule over her husband, right? And so she wants to make this decision. So she's going to make this independent in contrast to the desires of her husband. And so you have these children who are then divided. And what happens is Jacob gives the food to the father. And I'm sorry, well, we skipped a whole section, which I forgot to tell you that when Esau is hungry and he demands food, that he gives his birthright up to his younger brother. Okay, and then what's going to happen is the part of the story I was talking about, where Jacob comes and he gives the food to his father, but his father at this point, he can't see well because his eyes, he's old, and so he can only go by the sound. But he goes, yeah, this doesn't sound like my son Esau. It sounds more like Jacob. And so he says, let me reach out my hand and touch you. And because Esau was a very hairy man, and they had put the animal hair over his hands, when Isaac feels the hand of Jacob, he's actually feeling the animal skin, and it's very hairy, like it would have been with Esau. And so they deceive the father, Isaac. Father then blesses Jacob, thinking that it's actually Esau. And so not only does Jacob get Esau's birthright, but he also then gets his blessing. And so it's really just it's a very sad account of what's happening. And it undermines what we see in terms of man and woman and their relationship as image of God. It undermines the point of what they're supposed to do to represent God in his interests. So the Abrahamic and the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant are all are being ignored because they're not trying to establish the nation. They're more wanting to fulfill their own desires and needs. And so it's a really sad, very sad portion of scripture, but it shows that even in the midst of our human frailties and our disobedience, that God's perfect plan, his sovereign will never, ever be undone. And then as time goes on, what's again fascinating in the story is that Jacob, his name means deceiver, right? That he is going to meet even a better deceiver, because Isaac tells, look, I want you to marry somebody within our family, and to make sure that you do that, I want you to go to the land where Laban is. And Laban is even a better deceiver than Jacob. And he tricks Jacob. And in his tricking Jacob, Jacob wants to marry Rachel, and he loves Rachel. And he's willing to work 7 years for her. And when the night comes to consummate it, she's well veiled. It is dark. Laban makes a switcheroo, and in the place of Rachel, he gives his oldest daughter Leah. And when Jacob wakes up in the morning, he realizes it's not Rachel, it's Leah. And he is totally ticked that he has been deceived. The deceiver has been deceived by a greater deceiver. And then what happens is he works for additional 7 years to get Rachel, and then he works even longer then to be able to get his freedom and the freedom of the people. But within that, we also see that there's this battle that happens then between Leah, the older daughter, and Rachel, the younger daughter, but favored by Jacob. And so you have children. At this point, Rachel is barren. She's unable to have children. Again, a consequence of Genesis 3. But God is committed to building the nation, because he said, I'm going to make you a great nation, and his promise to Abraham at this point. And so what happens is Leah is able to bear children. And so then Rachel doesn't like that after she's bore 4 children and 4 boys. And so she then says, well, I'm going to give you my maidservant. Right now we're back to where we saw with both Abraham and Isaac, where they're willing to sacrifice the integrity of their family, and they're unwilling to lead the way they're supposed to lead. And as a result, you just keep playing this out. And so the maidservant has children, Rachel's does, but then Leah sees that, and so she gives her maidservant. And by the end, God finally opens up the womb of Rachel, and she, by the 11th child, has Joseph, and then has on the 12th child, she has Joseph, and then his brother Benjamin. But when she's giving birth to Benjamin, she dies. And all of this again was painted in the pictures of Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, that the woman is going to have this difficulty fulfill her role as the image of God from conception through birth. It's going to be made much more difficult than it is. But even more importantly is this their unwillingness to submit to the rule of God in their lives. And as a result, they introduce all this chaos. But by the end of that, God has begun to form the nucleus of what will become the nation of Israel. We have the 12 major tribes that will come out of these 12 brothers. And that really is the story of Genesis 25 through 36, is that in the midst of human rejection of God and his plan, that God will still use man's sinfulness to accomplish his greater purposes, and that he will fulfill his rescue plan through Abram to the world in spite of his people. And that's the story that we see in Genesis 25 through 36. May we not live those kind of lives, and that God has to he will continue to use our disobedience to accomplish his purpose. But can we just enjoy God and obey him and see the fruit of that, and that he gets to bless others because we have chosen to be obedient? So, that was a rough one, as you think about these stories. But that's what we're trying to understand, is the flow of the story and the plan of God.